Hello, this is the lecture for our 7th week when we talk about the economic policy of Franklin Roosevelt, the New Deal, as well as the specific boost to unionizing, to the labor movement, that new legislation during the New Deal brought. And there is a link between the wish for workers to join unions and the economic policy goals of Roosevelt, rooted in Roosevelt's analysis of what caused the crash of 1929. So we'll go back to that first before we get to the two other points. So we'll talk about the causes of the crash. We'll talk about the economic policy goals of the New Deal in order to get the country out of the Great Depression, and the role that the labor movement played in making that happen. That is to say, people who organize in unions. Now, last week, we established that the Great Depression and the stock market crash in 1929 were caused by capitalism. So much so general, but what specifically happened that led to this crash? It was, as we have seen, a crisis of overproduction. If you get to a point where the wages have been depressed to a level where the workers can no longer buy the things that they make, at some point, for capital, it becomes dysfunctional to invest money into facilities. After all, the whole point of making commodities for the market is so you can sell them. If you don't have anybody buying your stuff and you know that ahead of time, you're not even starting to make things. And the problem with that is that if you're not hiring people to make stuff, then fewer people are going to be able to buy things. And this, of course, leads to another spiral, another turn of the spiral down the road. So in the 1920s, the roaring 20s, things looked so good. So what went wrong? In fact, the working class was already making too little money, and too few people were employed to buy all the things that the shiny new industries of the 1920s were cranking out. You have all the novelty things at the time that need electricity. The broad application of electricity in households is new. Yes, the concept had been proven earlier. Businesses, places that could afford to have wires strung and so forth, might have had electricity before, but really the broad application, including telephones, is a thing of the 1920s. So suddenly you can have a radio at home, you can have a vacuum cleaner, you can have a washing machine. Outside of the home, the automobile, again, technology that had been around for a while, but to make it widely available. And in the United States, of course, this is mostly the work of Henry Ford and his Model T, which is cheap and produced with standardized parts. It runs off an almost completely automated production line where each worker knows just a handful of tasks to complete as the Models T zoom past him on a line. So this kind of rationalization, as they call it, Taylorism, after the one of the engineers working for Ford, who studied everything down to individual hand movements using the new tool of photography to time people, to look at optimizing everything, like how you held your body in relation to the piece of work and so forth. And then also to enforce that people follow those best practices by having overseers on the factory floor. To the point where people become an extension of the machine, in some cases literally, after World War I, when so many people come home with missing limbs, you get a prosthetics industry that is geared towards putting prosthetic limbs on people's hands for the most part, that allow them to operate a machine. And so in that they hook onto the machine with their prosthetic, it becomes almost like they are part of the machine, or vice versa. So all this is super productive. So you crank out many more items and you produce much more value per worker per hour, meaning that you can make more things with fewer workers, or you can make the same amount of you can make more things if you have the same amount of workers. So unemployment is going to rise, and the level of pay that the workers receive in these new factories is not going to enable them to buy things that they make. What is the solution for that? The solution is a temporary fix that leads up to this Great Depression, to the crash in 29. Installment payment plans. So you want a radio, but you can't afford one. Therefore, we're going to sell you one, and then you pay 15% interest on the installment plan. And if you can't make your monthly payment, we're going to come and repossess it. Same with the car, same with the vacuum cleaner. So by 1929, growth is sustained on borrowed money. And as soon as somewhere in the global money market, something no longer, something gets dammed in, something is interrupted, it's going to have a ripple effect, and that's precisely what happens. But the ground cause is a lack of purchasing power among the broad mass of consumers. So if you want capitalism to continue to do well, if you don't want to risk people losing faith in the system, and that was the policy goal of Franklin Roosevelt, of course. He did not want people to lose faith in capitalism. He wanted to save it from its own worst excesses. You have to put money into people's pockets so they can buy stuff, so that capital will then invest in making stuff that people can afford to buy. Underlying then the philosophy of Roosevelt's economic policy was a view of the market that was in part based on the theoretical work of John Maynard Keynes, a young economist at the time, but others too, who had found that the market moves in cycles. This is the timeline here, the base in green, and the market activity is high at this point, and eventually you get a crash, you get a recession, but at some point it turns around. Usually this is when obsolescence kicks in. So even if consumer demand remains low, industry also has demand. And if the machines that are still working, because they still make stuff that finds demand, if they break down, you have to build new ones. So it leads to a slow upturn. Eventually, if add innovation into the picture or rationalization, say somebody finds a way of making stuff more cheaply or quickly, then everybody does it, and eventually that market overheats and you get another crash. So this has been true for 120 years. By the time we get to 1929, it's a more or less 20-year interval between recessions. So this is a 20-year timeline. If the market is left to its own devices. The idea now behind Keynes' economic philosophy is that government can make sure you get a more even economic development in that it adjusts its own activity in the market to that of the market proper. So the light green line would be how much does government spend? Very little when the market is doing well. In fact, it takes in lots of taxes during that time, more as the market slows down, and a whole lot at the height of the recession, providing money into the pockets of individuals that will give an incentive to capital to invest in facilities. And as the economy improves, government dials down the spending and pays down the money it borrowed, and eventually, whoops, I just moved this curve here. I didn't even know I could do that. Eventually, it comes back up. So, and how does government do that? In fact, it also, it doesn't just hand over money to people to spend, although they do that too, and that is sensible, you know, because you want, if somebody is unemployed, they have zero money. spend on stuff. If any dollar you give to them is going to get spent on something that somebody else produced, giving that person work in the process. So that money wouldn't have been spent otherwise. But you also want to generate other incentives to invest for capital so that you may not even get all the way into the bottom of the trough here. And when the market starts to expand again, you want to cool down a bubble, an overheated market. You want to pop a bubble before it really becomes a problem, before it becomes too big. And you can do that with multiple tools. Central banking is one that has long been used since the days of Alexander Hamilton, expanding and contracting the money supply and the credit supply. But a more direct approach to regulating banking is taken in 1933 with the Glass-Steagall Act. And if you follow fiscal policy and economic policy, you've heard the name. It was scrapped in 1980. But after the 2008 crash, there was much talk about possibly reviving it, or the Dodd-Frank framework of regulation is an attempt to modernize and bring back a version of Glass-Steagall. It doesn't go as far, and it was almost immediately gutted by Wall Street lobbyists who were trying to hold up the agency created, to prevent that agency that was created to enforce Dodd-Frank from actually doing anything. Anywho, but in the 1930s, this worked quite well. Add to that, or as the means of putting money into the pockets of people who have nothing to spend, Social Security, which means that we go from 67% poverty rate among retired people in 1929 to a situation where old age poverty is no longer an issue, really. You assist the unemployed, those that can't find work, with temporary assistance. But most importantly, you want to get people back into employment, and then you want to make sure that they have decent wages. So you do that by strengthening unions. In some cases, the government employs people directly. And if you live in California, you're taking for granted government infrastructure projects that were built in the 1930s. You might have heard about the Golden Gate Bridge, or the General's Highway, or Highway 1 down Big Sur. Those are all public works projects where people were given tools and shovels and hired off the streets to improve infrastructure, to build public projects. But really, the most important part of the New Deal is to strengthen unions. And that is what you see going on at the San Francisco waterfront. Unions that were empowered, encouraged by the first wave of legislation of the New Deal, the NIRA, National Industrial Recovery Act. However, the problem with that had been that there was no enforcement mechanism. So it took a few more years before the Wagner Act of 1935 gave government policy some teeth. Now the government could actually force an employer to sit down with the union and bargain in good faith on both sides to agree on a contract for everybody working, on equal conditions for everybody working. And if one side bargained in bad faith, the National Labor Relations Board can impose something. And in the case of the San Francisco waterfront, the employers were completely intransigent. They didn't sit down to bargain. They refused to acknowledge the legitimacy of the union. They hired thugs off the street, gave them guns and clubs to rough up their workers. So eventually the National Labor Relations Board imposed a contract that was more or less directly what the union had brought to the table as their bargaining position. And that really changes the game, because before 1935, the core industries that were new, that hadn't already been organized under Samuel Gompers back in his day, remained without any unions and without any contracts. Meat processing, anything that goes into automobiles like rubber, electronics, steel, the making of automobiles proper, so much is completely open shop, no union, no contract. And the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, is not interested in organizing people because remember, they organize skilled workers. But in these highly automated factories, nobody needs that kind of skill. You don't have to hire a master butcher for a worker in a meat packing plant. You don't have a master puddler in a steel mill that has the Bessemer process implemented and that is increasingly mechanized and automated. So for that reason, the AFL has nobody to organize. When it looks at these industries, it sees 10,000 people with no skills, so it's not their field. They don't do that. In spite of the legislation, the commitment of the AFL to craft unionism, organizing people by their specialized skill and not organizing people without specialized skill, they turned down any suggestion at the conventions to expand industrial unionizing. So the mine workers pick up the slack and they finance a drive to organize industries that are unorganized and to organize them in under industrial union principles, meaning you don't organize just the craftsmen and you don't organize all the crafts separately, but everybody in a big factory, everybody in an industry gets to join the same union, skills or not. And so this turns out to be a winning model. By 1939, all the core industries in the country are now organized by militant industrial unions that have their own umbrella organization that rivals the AFL, known as the Congress of Industrial Organizations, CIO. Some of the hardest battles are fought against Henry Ford. When Henry Ford is told you need to bargain with the union in good faith or else, he appoints a manager for labor management relations, a thuggish former professional boxer who is known to be a hard right-winger and who says, well, you want to bargain with me, you know, I've got my boxing gloves right here. So that sends a signal, but he's trying to, you know, meet the formal criteria of the law while subverting its spirit. That doesn't do him much good. By the end of the decade, his factories are organized. Ford, by the way, Ford says, I'm going to just shut everything down before I ever sign a contract with the labor union. And his wife then threatens to leave him if he throws everything away like that. And that is what gets him to finally give in. It's crazy. But the AFL, the craft unions, the Gompers founded, take the CIO as a challenge, as a rival that needs to be crushed. So if you see in the sources evidence that the AFL and its affiliate unions actively fight against these new unions, that's why. There's one exception, which is the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. That operates within the AFL, and it goes against everything that the AFL has otherwise stood for. But we'll cover that on a different occasion. What's important about this example with the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters in the AFL, however, is that the person who leads that union is A. Philip Randolph, and he's somebody whose career we're going to follow up until the 1960s. He's a socialist. He's a dues-paying member of the Socialist Party. And as such, he represents an important part of this drive to unionize. He's an exception to the rule because he works within the AFL and they let him. But everywhere else, too, where you have new industries being organized, if you look closely, you see that the people who go out and risk their lives by standing there and signing workers up to join the union while they're being menaced by armed thugs working for the employer, are driven by an ideological commitment to work against capitalism, to work towards socialism. The Communist Party, which is tiny, has not very many members, nevertheless is the most militant in motivating and driving the members it does have to go to work in an industry and to fight to organize workers in that industry. And when they do that, in spite of the internal hierarchy of a communist party that is often not democratically organized, but it's a top-down thing, the communists who go and work in the labor force and organize unions there do it with an emphasis on democracy, on including everybody and hearing everybody's input and so forth. So if you look at Harry Bridges, he is a typical communist in that sense, in the way that he leads his union, both the militancy and the democracy. So the Communist Party is a small but crucial base of organizers, of cadres, of people who volunteer to actually take the personal risk to go into a factory against the wishes of the owner and try to get people organized so that they get better wage. So these three things, the reason for the crash, which speaks to slacking effective consumer demand, the fiscal and labor policies of the New Deal that aim at increasing consumer demand, and finally, the role of the left within the unions, within the labor movement, taken together, gives you a whole lot more context to make sense of what's happening here in these articles about the strikes on the San Francisco waterfront. And I hope you get to enjoy that reading. So that's it for this week. Goodbye.